Welcome to the Self-Publishing School podcast. This is the podcast to listen to if you're an aspiring writer or an author who wants to be more successful. On this show, you'll learn how to write and launch a book successfully, all from the top authors and people just like you who are doing it at the highest level. I'm your host, Chandler Bolt, the founder of Self-Publishing School, the author of the book called Published, and the CEO of selfpublishing.com. For free training on how to publish a book that sells 10,000 copies, go to selfpublishing.com/free training. Hey, Chandler Bolt here, and joining me today is my good friend, Jeff Goins. Jeff is a full-time writer who lives just outside of Nashville, Tennessee, with his wife, son, and border collie. Love border collies. Have one growing up. But he's the author of 4 books, including the national bestseller, The Art of Work. And his website, Goins Writer, has been visited by more than 4 million people from all over the world. And if you Google it, how to write a book, he's the #1 guy that comes up, which I'm jealous of. I'm not going to lie. I'm jealous. He's got some prime real estate there, but he's definitely the guy when it comes to writing. And I just always love chatting with him. You may remember his interview from the summit last year. So we're going to dive into some different stuff. So it'll be kind of a little bit of a different take, but Jeff, always great to chat. Good to have you here.
Thanks for having me, Chandler. Good to be here.
Awesome. So I want to start by just diving into this might go a little deep pretty fast, but I always like to go with the why. And I know last time we talked about why you wrote your first book. And so I really want to get into why do you continue to write? Like what drives you to write?
Well, I really think of writing as my calling, my purpose. I love doing it. There's that saying, I hate writing. I love having written. I don't agree with that. I love writing. I love the act of writing. It's not always it's not always fun, but it's really gratifying. And so I love writing. I feel like it's my purpose in life to connect people with ideas. And so I aspire to write words that change and impact culture. I mean, that's like my big goal. And so that's why I write. That's why I believe in writing. That's why I love helping other writers, is because I think words have the power to change the world. This idea that talk is cheap is not true. I mean, every revolution, every government, every great movement, civil rights movement, Gandhi, Jesus, any huge movement in history began with words. And so I think words are very powerful, and we often shortchange them. And so that's why I write. That's why I believe in words. And that's why I love what you're doing.
Awesome, man. Now take us back I want to go back to the first book and just kind of take us through what was the writing process of that first book, maybe some of the toughest parts and lessons you learned from that first book.
Yeah. So I basically wrote 2 books in a year. And the first book I wrote was the second book I published, which I think we talked about last time, where I had this blog. I grew it to thousands of subscribers, had a publisher contact me, and then submitted a book proposal to them, and then wrote this book called Wrecked, which is really based on my experience of working at a nonprofit for 7 years. It was about finding your purpose in the context of serving others. So it was this idea that you don't figure out what you're supposed to do with your life by thinking about you, but by thinking about others. And I approached that a lot like I had been approaching blogging, which is just sit down every day and write 500 words. And so I wrote an outline, and I just sat down and I just started working on it. And I think blogging can train you to write a book. It can also teach you some bad habits, because a book is not just a collection of blog posts. It needs to have an arc. It needs to have one argument, and that argument needs to be woven through each chapter. And the chapters need, at least for a nonfiction book, the chapters need to contribute to the argument. For a fiction book, there needs to be even more arc, because it's one story with each chapter having some sort of major movement in the plot that moves the story forward. But I learned how to write on a daily basis, and I think this is an important skill for any writer, is to just practice the discipline of daily writing. If you're going to write a book, like that's step one, is you got to start writing every day, just to get into the habit of sitting down every day and doing the work, however long that may be, for 10 minutes or, hours. You need to get into that habit. And blogging helped me do that. And yeah, I mean, that was the process of writing the book. It took about 3 or 4 months of just sitting down and writing about 30 minutes to an hour at a time in the mornings or evenings whenever I had time. But I did not let myself go to bed each night until I'd written at least 500 words contributing to that book.
Got it. So that was kind of your style with the first book was chunk it out, do a little bit each day, and constantly move forward. Has that remained the way that you write books, or has that process evolved?
My process is pretty messy. It's I'd like to think that each new book is my best book. So with the last book that I wrote, The Art of Work, it was this process of I wrote it all down, and then I scrapped it. I went and did a bunch of research, and then I rewrote the book based on that research. I did a bunch of original interviews with people and used all these custom case studies in the book and told a bunch of people's stories. That was a lot of fun, and I think made the book what it is today. But for me, it was a lot more research. And now I would say my process, because I write nonfiction books that are kind of in the personal development section, so they're intended to inspire and equip people to, live better, more creative, purposeful lives. A lot of research, and there's what's that Abraham Lincoln quote that he tweeted last week or something. There's all these Abraham Lincoln quotes on the internet. He says, if I had 7 hours to chop down a tree, I'd spend 6 of them sharpening my axe. The more I write, the more serious that I get about writing, the more time I spend preparing to write, which is surprising to me. I thought the hardest part of writing was just sitting down and doing it. I think that's hard. I mean, I think it's all pretty hard, it's all kind of difficult and equally rewarding. But now I'm trying to honor the process of thinking about writing. I think thinking about what you're going to say, like actually spending time reading, thinking, even taking notes, like processing what your argument is at least as important as writing it down, if not maybe a little bit more, because I have wasted hundreds of thousands of words on the wrong ideas. And so figuring out what the right idea is or what the right story is before you sit down to write it, that's pretty important. And some of it you'll figure out through writing, but a lot of it, I believe now, because this is what I'm learning, you can just figure it out ahead of time. And then when you sit down to write, the book comes together a lot more quickly.
Now I know maybe this was the same for you, maybe it wasn't, but I can remember in high school or college or whenever, and you're going to write a paper and the teacher tells you to do an outline, right? And you're like, well, that sounds stupid. I could just start writing, right? And I could
Right.
just, and then you open up that blank Word doc and you just want to beat your head into the keyboard because you're like, I don't know what to say. And so I feel like the preparation part is so undervalued and underappreciated because, like most people, you just want to start to write, right? So how is your approach? You talked about how you prepare more now. You sharpen the axe. How is your approach to preparation? How has that changed from that first book to the way you do it now?
I'm working on a book right now, and I gave myself 6 months to write it, and I spent 5 months doing research. And that doesn't mean you're not writing. Like, I'm interviewing people, I'm taking notes, I'm compiling, I'm organizing that, I'm trying to figure out, what does this all say? But typically, Chandler, the way the process works for me, writing a nonfiction book with an argument, is I start with the idea. I start with the thing that I think is true, like a hypothesis. And I go, like, I think this is true. Now I'm going to go test this hypothesis. I'm going to read a bunch of books. I'm going to read a bunch of books about this subject that make other arguments and see how what I think stands up against this, agrees with it, disagrees with it, see if I have anything new to contribute or not. And if I do, or if I read these books and I go, yeah, this is true, but what if this was true? And then I start, I do a lot of interviews with experts, and I get all that information, I compile it into an argument, and then I just go, okay, now I just have to connect these pieces. Now I just have to say what I think. And my books are, there's still a lot of my opinion and insight into it, but now I'm just sort of connecting pieces with my voice to kind of make it all fit. And, it works a lot faster. Think of it like this, you can get in your car and drive anywhere, right? But you're not going to get to where you want to go if you don't have a map, if you don't have some idea of what the destination looks like. And incidentally, if you don't have a map, you're not going to know when you get there. And so if you start writing and there's no real clear destination, you're not going to know when you're done. Whereas if you do an outline, and it could change, it will change. But if you at least start with some, basis, some semblance of a map, then you're going to have an idea once you're 80, 90% of the way there. And then you can, and then at that point, it's just tweaking versus wandering. But if you just get in your car and drive, you may end up nowhere. And sadly, a lot of people write books that way and then have to scrap those books or really, really do some intense surgery on them afterwards, because it's just, it's a really chaotic process. You can write a book that way. I've written books that way before. It's not the best way. It's not advisable. And you'll just waste a lot of words doing that. And I don't know about you, I'm a full-time writer and I still don't have a lot of time to write. And so if you're watching this thinking, where am I going to find the time to write? Invest some time in outlining your thoughts ahead of time so that when you sit down to write, whether it's 100 words or 1,000 words, they're productive words. They're usable words, not just, you just trying to throw something against the wall and see if it sticks.
Now, you talked about having that hypothesis. Where do you start? Like, how do you know where to start? What destination to pick? What hypothesis direction for your book? Like, how do you know when you've landed on one that's like, all right, this will go, right? I can write a whole book on that. And I guess the second question I have is once you do that, how do you pick the people to interview? Or because you talked about using interviews as a large part of the research process.
Yeah. I chase what I'm fascinated about. I chase what I'm curious about. But most of my books come from personal experience. And the personal experience is like my last book, The Art of Work. I became a full-time writer. A lot of people said, how did you do that? And I was like, well, I'm having so many conversations about this. Maybe there's a demand for this kind of book, which helps you find your calling, figures out what you're supposed to do with your life. I mean, obviously that's a big thing. And there's a demand for that. And I realized the conversations that I was having with friends were conversations that were happening in culture. And I don't know that you have to write a book that way, but those are the kinds of books that I aspire to write because I want to enter that cultural conversation and contribute something to it. I was once at a blogging conference one time, and this woman came up to me and told me her idea for a book. And I said, what other books are there out there like this? Like, what other books out there are like this? And she said, none. Like, there's no book like this. You have no, it's never been done. It's going to be amazing. People need this book. And I said, if there's no books out there like this, how do you know anybody wants to read this? Like, that's the worst thing in the world, is for there to be no books out there like this. So if you have an idea, and we all have ideas for books, let's just be honest. So where do ideas come from? They come from conversations. They come from people saying, how did you do this? And so I have lots of ideas. That's not when I decide to write a book just because I have an idea. Then I take the idea and I go read 3 or 4 books that are in that genre, right? That are in that vein and that are like those books. And if I feel like what I wanted to say was already said and it was said in the way that I more or less would say it, then I don't write the book. We don't just need more books out there for the sake of our egos as writers, because what you want is you want to put something out there that people are going to read, that's going to help them. And if all you're doing is recycling what somebody else has said, does it really need to be said if you're not contributing something somewhat new or interesting to the conversation? Now, on the other hand, if it's so new and it's so novel and it's so groundbreaking, there may be no demand for it. And so really, I figure out what I want to say by going, what's something that interests me? What's a bunch of conversations that I'd rather not have and just say, here, read my book.
Yeah.
What is something that I feel like people need that isn't out there yet? And then I go and I see what's out there. And then I usually say, well, I like this, but I don't like this. I disagree with this. In the case of the last book, The Art of Work, lots of people talk about finding your purpose, figuring out how to be successful in life. But what I realize is most of those books say, here's the 7 things that you need to know. Step 1, figure out what you want to do. I don't know about you, but everybody I talk to doesn't know what their passion is, doesn't know what their calling is. So step 1, they're out. So I wrote this book for everybody else who goes, I don't know. Great. Guess what? There are a lot of people who are doing really interesting work in the world that didn't know and still don't know either. You can still take steps along the way. So read a few books, figure out what's missing, and then you fill that niche, you fill that little hole. And if you do it well and you do it right, it's going to help people.
Now, do you ever have times where you just have way too many ideas and you have to narrow that down into like, what am I going to write about next?
Yeah, absolutely. Totally. And I'm at this point right now because I'm working on the next book. And about halfway through like the current book, I get bored and I'm like, well, I'm going to start thinking about the next book, and I start like writing notes or whatever. And it's interesting because I have an Evernote folder of like book ideas where I realize I just start clipping things that fascinate me and they end up becoming the next book. And they always happen like right in the middle of like the previous book. So yeah, I always have too many ideas. And I've done the thing where I wrote the book that I wanted to write because I wanted to write it. I've done that. And it didn't sell well. And for all the things that people say, but just write it and get it out there in the world. I just realized like I don't like it's not ego for me. It's about helping people, and I don't want to write books that don't help people. And every time you write a book, there's a little bit of an act of faith, but there are lots of ways that you can test the viability of an idea before you put it out there. You teach people how to do this, Chandler, understanding what category you're in and how to even optimize things like titles and tags. And like those things are important because you want this to reach people. You want to encourage them. You want to entertain them. You want to help them, inspire them, whatever you want to do. You want to connect with people. No writer have I ever met that said, I don't want anybody to read my book. You may not need millions of people to read your books. That's fine. But you want to write something that's hopefully going to connect with somebody. So I will never just write a book because I feel like I need to write it, at least not in the foreseeable future. I want to write the thing that I want to write, but I want to do it in a way that's going to connect with the needs of my audience. And so for me, I get lots of ideas, and my blog is where I test out those ideas, or Twitter or Facebook. I ask questions. I put things out there. I mean, you'll see on my blog me testing ideas to see how the audience responds to them. Because sometimes I don't know the answer. Sometimes I'm just asking the questions. That's usually the case. And I want to find out, what do people think about this? What do they believe about it? And then I get responses and I go, that's interesting. And either like when I hear crickets, I go, well, like that's interesting too. Maybe there's not a desire for that. And again, I mean, maybe everybody's different, but for me, like if we're sitting down for dinner, like there's 27 topics that we could talk about, things that I could say. I don't want to just talk about whatever. I want to go, well, I know Chandler, and we should talk about books and maybe entrepreneurship and, writing. And like, we should talk about the things that are relevant to this conversation between the two of us. When I sit down with my wife, I'm going to be talking about something else. I have lots of things that I could be talking about at any given time. I want to make sure that I'm talking about the right thing at the right time for the right person, the right audience. And so, yeah, I've always got lots of ideas, and I put them in an Evernote folder, and I'm often asking myself the question, have I tested this idea? Is it viable? And is this the right idea for the right time? There's that Victor Hugo quote, which I love. There's nothing like an idea whose time has come. There's nothing more powerful than that. And so I have lots of ideas that it may not be time for them, or their time may be past. I don't know. But I think that's a good question. And I think there are very practical ways today with social media and just taking your friends out for coffee where you can just kind of float ideas. You don't say I have an idea for a book, because that's going to depress you, because they're going to go, what? They're going to go, what? And you're going to get all depressed and feel like you have a bad idea because it's a half-formed idea. But if you just start talking about something, like I remember when I was working on this book, The Art of Work, I was just having conversations with friends, and we started talking about calling and what they wanted to do. And one was a stay-at-home mom, and one was, a musician. Another one was, working for a computer company. And I just asked them, I said, do you guys feel like you know what your calling is? And they said, no, I don't know, but I feel like I have one, and I wish I knew what to do. And I was like, that's so interesting, right? And so I go home and I write, and I go, I think I have something that can help these people. That, to me, that's the most exciting thing about this is you enter into a conversation and you realize that you have something that people need, that they want, and it's going to help them in some way. And again, maybe that's just telling a story that inspires them, that makes them think about the world in a different way.
Hey, Chandler Bolt here. I hope you're loving this episode so far. It's time to go from inspiration to implementation. All right, so if you've learned something, we want to help you implement what you've learned with your book. So what I want you to do right now is go to selfpublishing.com/schedule, book a publishing consultation with one of the experts on my team. We'll talk about your goals for your book, your dreams, your challenges, your next steps, and we'll start putting together a plan. All right, so go to selfpublishing.com/schedule, book a call with the team. Let's see how we can help with your book. It's time to implement. Now you have a book called it's called You're a Writer. You're a Writer, so start acting like one. What do you think it means to act like a writer?
I think that activity follows identity. So the reason I wrote that book is because before you can go do writing, you have to become a writer. I believe that. Some people hate that I say that. I saw somebody on Twitter say this. I think there's two paradigms about professional writing that I disagree with. One, both these things happen on Twitter, as all good and bad things do. One was this conversation that this amateur writer was having with this quote unquote professional writer, and the professional writer said, "You don't get to call yourself a writer until you've written and published at least 3 books." And I was like, where does that come from? I said, so like Harper Lee, the author of To Kill a Mockingbird, one of the best-selling books of the 20th century, like she doesn't count. Because really she wrote like 1 book and then they published a book that she like wrote before and right before she died and never really finished, and they published it. So at best she wrote 2 books in her life. So she's not an author. Who else is not an author? I thought that's ridiculous. There's this idea that until point X, you don't get to call yourself a writer. This is not my idea. I talked to Stephen Pressfield, the author of The War of Art and many other great books. And I said, when does a writer get to call himself a writer, Steve? He said, you are when you say you are. Screw what everybody else says or thinks. You are when you say you are. It's not a badge. It's not a diploma. It's not a certificate. It's a mindset. You get to be a writer whenever you want to be. And incidentally, if you don't ever want to be one, or you never think you're good enough, you're never going to feel like one. So that's the first mindset that I think you have to break, which is that I'm not a writer until I get to this point. It's not true. Start with this mindset that you are a writer and then start acting like one. So, what does it mean to act like one? Well, the second mindset is this. I think this is fascinating. Again, I saw this very successful author of these like thriller novels on Twitter, and somebody tweeted at him and said, "Hey, how do you become a writer? Like, I want to be a writer. How do you become a writer?" This is something that every writer hears. And he says, "You can't become a writer. You either have it or you don't." Awesome. Sweet. Like, I'm either born with it or I'm not. I think that's a deplorable idea. If you feel like you were born to be a writer, great. If you want to become a writer, the way that you do that, I think, is you own the title and then very quickly you start writing. What do writers do? I think pretty roughly they think of themselves as writers, because I think if you think like an amateur, you'll act like an amateur. And if you think like a pro, you'll eventually start acting like a pro. How do you become a good writer? Like anything, you just practice. Forget about this idea that you have it in you. Anders Ericsson wrote this book called Peak. He is the guy who came up with the original research that became the 10,000 hour rule. And he says, look, like everything we understand about science, with some like random exceptions, basically says that in the brain, like there's nothing that prohibits somebody from learning a skill and becoming great at it. Chess, writing, math. Now, we grow up in certain environments where these skills are cultivated or not. And so by the time you get to 20, 30 years old, you feel like, oh, I'm not any good at this. It just never came naturally to me. That's probably not true. And if you want to use that excuse as I do to say, I'm not good at math, I'm not going to try, that's totally cool. But if you want to use that excuse towards something that you really want to do, like writing, and say, I'll never get as good as I want to be, that's not true. It doesn't have to be true. If you start thinking about yourself as a writer and start acting like it, to me, that's something as simple as getting up every day and trying to write 500 words a day. If you do that by the end of a year, you could have a book, if not sooner. Every book I write, I log into Scrivener and I say, I want to write 500 words a day, and here's my deadline, and here's how many days a week I want to write. And you put this little project target in there. And then every day I log into Scrivener and they say, are you on track? Are you ahead? Are you behind? It just tells me. But books for me get written, slow and steady, this plotting process. And that's how you become a writer too. You just get up every day and you write a little bit. And over time, you become better and better at it. You find your voice, you figure out what you want to say, you build an audience, but it all begins and ends with words. There's really nothing else to it.
Why do you think so many people struggle with writing their first book or becoming a writer? What do you think gets in their way?
Well, I think writing a book, like anything, you don't know how to do it until you've done it. I spoke with a guy one time who was a dad of 4 or 5 children. He has 6 kids now. A couple of them are adopted. And I'm sitting down with him, getting ready to have my first kid. And I go, any tips for becoming a dad? And he goes, you become a dad like you become a writer, like you do it. Like that's how you become it, is you do it. You become, like, you just start writing and you're a writer, and you have this kid pops out and you go, I'm a dad now, and I have to start thinking like it, and I have responsibilities associated with it. So why is writing a book hard? Because you've never done it before. You have no idea. So you do it to figure out what it requires, and then hopefully you do it again and again and again. Some people, like Harper Lee, like they're going to have one masterpiece and they're going to put it out there in the world, and that's great. Most people are not. I'm trying to write a lot of books early in my career in hopes of having many decades of writing opportunity. And I tell people, I'm just trying to get the bad ones out of the way. So if you didn't read book 1 or book 2, that's okay. Hopefully they're getting better. Hopefully I'm getting better. Nothing grows you as a writer like writing a book. Nothing. And so I love that it forces you to think about something, outline it, write it, rewrite it, and then ship it. And that makes you better. So why do people struggle with that? Because they've never done it before. Why do people get in their own way? I think it's the solitary thing. I think when you're in a room by yourself with your characters or your ideas, it's so easy to doubt yourself. And especially if you haven't had any success, and most of us haven't had the success that we want to have, or that we think we will have someday, or we should have. And so we're constantly doubting ourselves, and we're not seeing the impact that the book is making. Writing books are hard. Writing books is hard because you spend a year or 2 or 5 on this thing, and you put it out there in the world. And for the most part, the biggest congratulations you get is an email. It's pretty thankless work. Like the biggest attaboy pat on the back you get is a certain number of stars on a website. That's not really gratifying. I wish people would send me cupcakes, it would positively reinforce the activity a little bit more. It's so easy to get discouraged because you don't directly see the impact that you get to have. And that's why A, you have to love it. And B, I think you have to audaciously believe that your work is intended for someone else. It doesn't have to be a million people, but it does mean that you're writing for somebody who needs this story, needs this idea, needs these brave words to be said in the way that only you can say them, so that you can set somebody free or give them hope or help them do something that they've never done before. And but it is hard. And I don't know of any tricks to get out of your way except to do it and to audaciously believe that it's for someone.
Love it. Okay, now a couple final questions, kind of as we're in the home stretch here.
Yeah.
So, what we found inside self-publishing school, and I'm sure what you've seen when you're teaching people this process, is there seems to be 2 types of people, right? There's the people who love the writing and then hate the marketing, or the people who love the marketing and just barely get by the writing process. So what have you seen in terms of the creation versus the selling process? And especially, how do you balance the 2 in your life and in your business?
I actually love both of these. I mean, I probably lean a little bit more towards writing because I love writing, and I'm a big fan of great writing. But I am a marketer, and it's one of the hats that I wear. I've worn that hat for over a decade. I was a marketing director at a nonprofit, and a lot of what you have to do as a writer nowadays is market yourself. And I love what Austin Kleon says about this. We tend to think of these as separate activities. I think they're more integrated. And he says that talking about the work is the work, right? Talking about the work is the work. Marketing the book, I mean, it's part of your job. Now, if all you're doing is talking about the work and not doing the work, like that's not good. So that like it's a collaborative process. But I find that if you do it in the right way, marketing makes you a better writer because you're getting feedback from your audience. All marketing is putting stuff out in the world and getting feedback. So what's my approach to that? It used to be write a good book and then, market it. I actually think that's not the best way to do it now. Everything that I have read about, studied, researched, and done myself, I realized that the best marketing is done before the book is finished. And so some of the best-selling books of all time, especially in the nonfiction space, they're sticky, and they're very marketable. Think about like How to Win Friends and Influence People, like a book that just continues to sell forever. And it's so pithy, like you start each chapter, they're short chapters. They've got these little interesting stories and they start with these little lines, the best way to, like the sweetest sound to a person's ear is their own name. And then he tells the story. And then at the end of the chapter, he says that same thing over again. And it just sticks with you, right? So what I've realized, and I did this for the first time with the last book, The Art of Work, where I wrote a book and then I went back and I kind of like baked the marketing into it. And I asked myself, what is it that I want people to remember about this book? And I went chapter by chapter and I said, big point, big point, big point. And I just put that phrase at the beginning of every chapter. I learned this from Bob Goff. He wrote this book called Love Does, sold over 1 million copies. And it's I love it because there's just these random stories, but they have these lessons. And at the beginning of each chapter, you know what the lesson is. And then he tells the story and then he reminds you of the lesson. And so I just stole that. I just stole that. I thought it was a cool thing. And so like Bob has this thing where he talks about about opportunities and that thing, like when God closes a door, he opens a window or whatever. And he spins that. And he talks about how he got into law school, after like doing horrible on the LSAT. And he just goes and sits outside the dean's, the law school dean's office every day and just waits for him to let him into school. And he talks about how he started to date his wife who did not want to date him, just being persistent. And he said, sometimes when, God closes a door, he wants you to kick the door down, like there's something about perseverance. That's a surprising, interesting, sticky thought. So writing and marketing, they're integrated. And so when you're writing the book, think about the conversation. If you want the book to sell and you want people to talk about it, think about the conversations that you want people to have about your book. How can you name things? How can you give them pithy little phrases that they can tell their friends? You don't have to, like, part of me feels like that, like that's a little bit sleazy. Like part of me feels like yucky about it. And then I just have to remember, like, I'm helping people retain this information. And it doesn't, like, maybe when you're doing it, it feels like, oh, do I have to do that? I want to be so clever that people just get it. But that's not the way it works. When I'm reading a book and I don't know what the point is, I don't know where the story is going, I don't know where the argument is going, I'm bored, I'm done. I want to be led to where you're going. So I try to think about all that stuff while I'm writing it. I love the writing. I want it to be beautiful prose, but I don't want it to just be, flowery for the sake of being flowery. I want it to connect with people. I really don't want somebody to read my book and say, great book, it was the best book I read. I would much rather somebody say, I read your book and I did this. That's just me, but I read your book and I went home and kissed my kids because I just realized life is precious. Or I read your book and I went and quit my job. Or I read your book and I did this. Like, to me, that's the greatest compliment. And I realized, like, if that's what I want, like, I have to put actionable stuff in the book, in order to get people to do stuff. So it's integrated for me. And I mean, here's the truth, Chandler. I'm sort of camping on this idea, but it's an important one. If you bake the marketing, and this is just putting stuff in the book that you want people to say, but put it all in the book. If you bake the marketing into the book, it makes it way easier to market the book.
100% agree with that. Now, Jeff, what will be your parting tip or your parting piece of advice for someone who wants to become a writer, who wants to get that first book out there, but maybe they're scared to do it, and maybe they just can't take that first step?
So if you want to become a writer, you just start by calling yourself a writer. If you want to become an author, because writing is something anybody can do. If you want to become an author, you have to publish a book. And I think you should sign up for self-publishing school. I mean, it's a great program, and it'll help you, get to where you want to go. I think, beyond that, I would try to find one person who needs the book and just take them out to coffee and just talk to them. So, keep talking about this idea. Again, don't say I have an idea for a book. Just talk about the idea. Ask them a question and about a problem that they haven't solved, or, a story, or whatever the thing is. And if you can find one person who needs this book, I mean, I think you've got something. If you can't, then you've got to move on to another idea. But I would begin with that, an idea and a reader. And I think everything else is just kind of filling in the in-between.
Love it. Jeff, thank you so much for coming on. It's always great chatting, always great catching up. Where can people go to find out more about you, your books, and what you're up to?
Yeah, thanks for having me. Go to my blog, goinswriter.com, Goins writer.com, and you can get a free ebook, and I share lots of tips for writers there, and a lot of other fun stuff. So check it out at goinswriter.com.
Perfect. Or just Google how to write a book, and
That's true. That's true. Do that.
Awesome. Thanks, Jeff. Thank you so much for watching or listening to this episode of the Self-Publishing School podcast. I know there's so many places that you can be spending your time. There's other podcasts that you could be listening to, YouTube channels that you could be watching. So thank you so much. It means the world. Now, I want you to do 3 things right now if you found this episode helpful. All right, number 1, I don't know if you know this, but we've got a YouTube channel. It's a companion channel to this podcast. All the video versions of the episode are on the YouTube channel. So number 1, subscribe to the YouTube channel. Number 2, if you're listening to this podcast wherever, whether this is Spotify, Apple Podcasts, number 2, I want you to subscribe to this podcast right now so you don't miss a future episode. And then number 3, this is probably the most important, leave a review on the podcast. All right, reviews are super important and help the podcast get discovered by other people. So number 3, leave a review on the podcast. Thank you so much. I'll see you in the next episode. If you're on the fence about scheduling a publishing consultation call with my team, maybe you're not quite ready for that, I've got some free training that I think will be really helpful for you. All right, all you have to do is go to register to sign up. Go to selfpublishing.com/free training. When you do, you're also going to get a free digital copy of my new book, Published. And on that training, you're going to learn the next steps, so how to implement with your book. So how to write, how to publish, how to launch successfully. So go to register right now at selfpublishing.com/free training. I'll see you there.